this morning, and I'd just like to say that today and tomorrow, the three countries here, represented here, are united.
John, William? No, I think William. John?
Okay. Good morning. Thank you, Laurent. I'm pleased to be here with my colleagues, where, as you will have gathered, as you've heard from Laurent Fabius, we've been discussing urgent steps to implement the US-Russia agreement on the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons, and I pay tribute to Secretary Kerry for the work that he has done with Foreign Minister Lavrov on this. We are in close accord about this as allies, including about the part that the credible threat of military force has played in bringing about this opening, this new possibility. And our first priority is to secure prompt action at the United Nations Security Council that enshrines in a Security Council resolution the Syrian regime's responsibility to hand over its chemical weapons stocks. A resolution, in our view, should create a binding commitment for the regime to give up its chemical weapons within a specific time frame and to credibly, reliably and promptly place them under international control for destruction. It is the Assad regime that has stockpiled these weapons and that has used them repeatedly against the Syrian people. So the pressure is on them to comply with this agreement in full. The world must be prepared to hold them to account if they don't, and our three countries are certainly determined to do so. We've agreed on the vital importance of accountability for those responsible for using chemical weapons in Syria, and will consult in the future about how that can be achieved in the light of the UN inspector's report in New York later today. And third, we're determined to do everything we can, as you have heard, to stop the bloodshed in Syria, to support the moderate opposition, and to alleviate humanitarian suffering. Our goal remains to convene a second Geneva conference to bring all sides together to agree a political solution to the conflict, and we will work with Russia on bringing that about as soon as possible. In that regard, I welcome the National Coalition's decision to appoint an interim Prime Minister, Ahmed Tomeh. There can be no peaceful settlement in Syria without the legitimate Syrian opposition. So the task ahead is very difficult and complex, but our three countries are united and determined to use our full weight as permanent members of the United Nations Security Council and as each other's close allies to implement the agreement on Syria's chemical weapons, to maintain the pressure on the Assad regime, and to bring about a peaceful end to this appalling conflict. Thank you.
Merci, William. John?
Thank you, Laurent. Je souhaite remercier le président Hollande et le ministre des Affaires étrangères Fabius pour leur accueil extraordinairement chaleureux et généreux. We're very grateful to the President of France for his welcome here today, and grateful to our colleague, Laurent Fabius, for his leadership and for his welcome back to Paris so soon, but for a very important discussion with an important turn of events since I was last here. A week ago, the Syrian regime did not admit that it even had chemical weapons. Today, that regime has agreed, at least through the Russians and in some statements publicly, to rid itself of those weapons, to be accountable to the world and its standards, and to sign up to the Chemical Weapons Convention. Clearly, nothing can be accepted at face value or in words alone. And that is why our meeting and the efforts of the international community to go to the United Nations in these next days is so critical. It is significant that three permanent members of the United Nations Security Council are standing here together, three partners, all joined in unity of purpose and of understanding of what needs to be done. And I want to thank Foreign Minister Fabius and Foreign Secretary Hague for their constant collaboration in these last days as we have worked towards this unique initiative to secure Syria's chemical weapons. And I know that I speak for President Obama when I say we are very grateful in the United States to have such able and willing partners. As I said in Jerusalem yesterday, we're now moving to translate into a broader international effort what was achieved in Geneva with the cooperation of the Russians, with the efforts of President Putin and Foreign Minister Lavrov. But each of us here today are here to emphasize the same thing, that what we achieve in this agreement as we translate Geneva Agreement into a United Nations resolution has to be strong, and it has to be forceful, it has to be real, it has to be accountable, it has to be transparent, it has to be timely. All of those things are critical, and it has to be enforced. If the Assad regime believes that this is not enforceable and that we are not serious, they will play games. And we know that even the UN inspectors who were there recently had difficulties getting access in some places. That is why in Geneva, the Russians agreed with us that there should be unfettered, unrestricted access to sites in order to make certain we do this as rapidly as is possible. What we're talking about here is an effective action. And every one of us understands that our standing here today and the announcement we made in Geneva will not have meaning until this is ratified at the United Nations in the strongest, most forceful terms possible, and until it is implemented and complied with by the Assad regime. So that's why we have insisted on this unique, very special structure of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons through the Convention on Chemical Weapons to be able to move as rapidly as is necessary. I can speak for all of us here, and I think for our presidents and prime minister, we will not tolerate avoidance or anything less than full compliance by the Assad regime to the core principles of what has been achieved here. If Assad fails to comply with the terms of this framework, make no mistake, we are all agreed, and that includes Russia, that there will be consequences. The framework fully commits the United States and Russia to impose measures under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter in the event of non-compliance. And President Obama, and I have repeated his statement, has warned that should diplomacy fail, the military option is still on the table. So we also want to emphasize something else of great importance here. Removal of the chemical weapons takes away from Assad one of the tools that he has been using against the opposition, against the people of his country, to subjugate, oppress their aspirations for freedom and for opportunity and for a role in the governance of their country. That will be taken away from him, and that will, therefore, make the opposition safer. But nothing in what we've done is meant to offer any notion to Assad that there's some legitimacy to his process, that he has some extended period as a leader, so-called. We make it clear that Assad has lost all legitimacy to be possible to govern this country, and we remain committed to the opposition and committed to the Geneva process, which calls for a transition government with full executive authority by mutual consent of the parties that will lay out the structure for the new Syria. That's our end strategic goal here. And all of us remain committed to that goal and committed to ending the violence as soon as possible. We understand that removing the chemical weapons still leaves him with artillery and airplanes, and he uses them, indiscriminately against his people. And we are going to do everything in our power to continue to push towards the political resolution that is so critical to ending that violence. We will all be in New York. We will be working with our colleagues there. We will meet with Lakhdar Brahimi on the margins of the United Nations General Assembly meetings, and we will do everything in our power to help the people of Syria to get out from under this chaos and violence that is creating such a human catastrophe for all of us, not only to witness, but to have to deal with. Thank you, Laurent.
Merci, John. Nous allons prendre 2 questions pour chacun, si vous voulez bien. Et monsieur, je vous en prie.
So foreign ministers will now just take 2 questions from
Apporter un micro.
each from the journalists here gathered. Just a reminder, if you are just joining us here, you're watching a joint news conference between France, Britain and the United States. The foreign ministers of those 3 countries have been holding talks this morning to agree on the terms of
Secretary Kerry, you spoke about
UN resolution.
a strategic goal, and that's quite interesting. In your strategy, are you thinking of the Christians of Syria and Lebanon? The result, one of the main results, unfortunately, of 7 years of American and English occupation of Iraq is the decimation and exile of most Christians in Iraq. We all remember Mr. Kissinger thinking of transporting in '75 the Christians of Lebanon to Canada. Do you have a plan, a strategic goal, how to protect the Christians in Syria? There's 2 bishops of Aleppo who are kidnapped today. Malula, old Christian city, without any strategic interest, has been invaded by Islamist rebels. They killed people and they looted the churches. Do you have a plan, a strategic plan for the Christians in Syria?
Merci.
The answer is yes, but I don't agree with your premise that what has happened to the Christians is the consequence of what happened by the events in Iraq. And make it clear, there are lots of problems as a consequence of the war in Iraq, and we understand them, and many of them negative. But that is, I do not believe, one of the direct ones. What we have is, with a rise of radical Islam and religious extremism and ideological extremism in many parts of not just that region but elsewhere in the world, there is an effort to impose a unity of belief on people. Taliban, Afghanistan, many other places, where there is not room for what we share as a matter of common values, is tolerance and acceptance of people of different faiths and different beliefs, and many other things. Regrettably, it is not just the Christians who have been impacted. It is the Druze, it is the Ismaili, it is all of the minorities. And the irony is the Alawi themselves are a minority, doing this to these other people for control, for Assad's control. So the fact is that the vision of Geneva I is a transition to a government that will embrace all of these minorities and protect all of these minorities and allow for a new Syria that is diverse and secular and creates a governance process that will protect all of the minorities, as well as establish rights by which people will know they can live and participate in the governance of their country. That's the new Syria. And the opposition has put out a very clear declaration of principles, which they did, I believe, in Amman as well as in Ankara, as well as in Istanbul, that make clear their commitment to this embrace of tolerance, diversity, protection of minorities, and full declaration of rights. So that's the distinction here. And I hate to say it, it's not just in Syria, but it's in parts of the Maghreb, in the Sahel, Mali, elsewhere, that we see this struggle between this extremist, religious advance against modernity and pluralism and the values that we hold dear. It's our hope that we can prove to people in a new Syria that people can live alongside each other and that there are a different set of principles by which the world can organize itself. And we've been fighting on these kinds of things for a long period of time. It doesn't make them any less valuable today.
Christian Mallard, France
Merci, Monsieur Mallard.
Christian Mallard, France 3. Question for the three of you. It seems that Russian President Putin and Mr. Lavrov, his Secretary of Foreign Affairs, are already reluctant to any use of force in case the agreement is not respected by Bashar al-Assad. So aren't we already going to a kind of veto by the Russians and the Chinese at the UN Security Council?
Là-dessus, à une question posée en anglais, je répondrai en français.
The French Foreign Minister
Nous avons expliqué
answering this question in French and just saying, in English rather, I should say,
il y a eu un accord,
or in French,
des
excuse me,
avancées très
and
importantes
just saying there's been an agreement
réalisées à Genève et il faut
in Geneva,
remercier et féliciter
which I would like to thank
l'a fait.
the US Secretary of State John Kerry.
Maintenant, tout ceci doit se traduire dans une résolution.
But all of this needs to be translated
Travailler
in Security Council resolution. We've started working on how to make this, to move this forward towards making a UN
chimique du 21
resolution. Tonight, the UN inspectors give their report on the massacre on the 21st of August.
collègues.
And in the coming hours, we as the P3 and our other colleagues will put forward a resolution.
Reprendra les éléments
This resolution
de Genève,
will take the elements of the Geneva Accord
positif, international.
in order to turn them into international
d'ailleurs,
law. And of course,
Ça a été précisé à Genève. Cette résolution
as was already said
si,
in the Geneva resolution,
verra ce qui se passe
Will.
si les Syriens
will also include the consequences
engagement.
if the Syrians do not respect their commitments. Any resolution
Traduction concrète, des sanctions. Et c'est dans cette
also contains sanctions,
travail.
and it's in that spirit that
Monsieur
we're
le Ministre.
working.
Monsieur le Ministre, bonjour. Ulysse Gosset de BFM and Secretary Kerry. Are you going to mention in this resolution that is not completely written? Est-ce que vous allez mentionner dans cette résolution
Foreign
le
Minister being
chapitre 7,
asked now, will you mention in this resolution, Chapter 7,
où le régime de
i.e. the
Damas
use of force
ne respecte
if
pas
the
ses
Damascus
engagements?
regime does
Et
not
puis,
respect its commitments?
Monsieur Kerry, Monsieur Hague, Monsieur Fabius, est-ce que vous faites confiance à Vladimir Poutine
And
pour que cet
do you
accord
trust
soit
Vladimir Putin
respecté? Merci.
for this accord to be
Well, it's
respected?
not a matter of confidence. It's a matter of verifying. It's a matter of specificity in what we do in this resolution and in the enforcement of the resolution. As I said in Geneva, there was an old saying from Gorbachev and President Reagan of trust but verify. We're talking about verify and verify. Not a matter of trust. So we're going to work hard to have a resolution that is as strong and forceful as possible. Now, Russia did agree in Geneva that Chapter 7 is mentioned specifically as the route for compliance if there is non-compliance or any use of chemical weapons by anyone in Syria. Under both of those circumstances, use of weapon or non-compliance, you're already automatically in Chapter 7 according to the agreement we came out of Geneva with. So that mention is there.
Merci. On va prendre une question peut-être d'un journaliste étranger.
Michael Gordon, the New York Times.
Allez-y.
Thank you. Michael Gordon from the New York Times. A question for the French Foreign Minister, the British Foreign Secretary, Mr. Kerry. In articulating a plan to dismantle Syria's chemical weapons, are you not pursuing a short-term goal at the expense of the ultimate objective of pressing Bashar al-Assad to leave power, especially since eliminating Syria's chemical weapons on such an ambitious schedule by the middle of 2014 depends critically on the cooperation of the Assad government over the ensuing months? And how are you going to guard against the sort of scenario that we saw in Iraq in the 90s, where there were years of prolonged discussions, allegations of cheating, evasions on the part of the Iraqis, and deliberations over what to do about it? How are you going to prevent this from really dragging on for an extended period of time?
Well, this is it's extremely important, of course, that there are no evasions, that there is no cat and mouse game going on about these weapons. That's the importance of the agreement that Secretary Kerry has made with Russia, and the importance of the Assad regime saying that it will sign up to international obligations on chemical weapons. We now have to have a resolution which crystallizes a binding commitment and which makes sure that this is dealt with credibly, reliably, and promptly as well. So it's a very important aspect of what we're talking about now, that there are specific time frames and that there will be means of holding the Assad regime to account on this. I don't agree, and I suspect my colleagues wouldn't agree, that there is any incompatibility with this and all of our other goals on Syria. It's very important to deal with the use of chemical weapons, which we have seen on August 21st and in previous instances. That dealing with that is not incompatible at all, far from it, with also pursuing our goal of a political solution to end the conflict, and indeed our other goal in parallel, which is to alleviate humanitarian suffering on which our countries are working so hard. So I don't think there is any conflict at all between those things, but my colleagues can expand on that.
There is no contradiction at all between the two elements. I mean, the military action, well, things about dealing with chemical weapons and what you call the strategic perspective. On the contrary, it's not incompatible. It's part and parcel of the same process. First, if Bashar has changed his position, it's because we have been, all of us, very firm. And it will be a weakening of his position not to be able to take hold of the chemical weapons. Because without chemical weapons, he cannot use them against its own people and against the neighbors. Therefore, he will be weakened. And he must understand that there is no military victory, no possible military victory for him. The regime has to come to the table of negotiations, and they have to understand that there is no military solution for them and that it is only a political solution. And it's the reason why it's not incompatible, but on the contrary, it's the same process dealing with chemical weapons and dealing with what you call strategic perspective.
Michael,
Yes.
in Iraq, inspectors were looking for weapons that they didn't know existed. Here, we know they exist. We have agreed on the amount, almost, somewhere between 1,000 to 1,200, 1,300 metric tons. We've agreed. We've agreed on the types of weapons. We're not looking for something that we don't know exists. We're looking for something that's been used and that the regime itself has admitted it has. So this is entirely different from Iraq, which is why we believe we can contain this in a short period of time. Secondly, Assad has taken pains to control these weapons so they don't fall into the hands of the opposition. And we know, because they're in the areas that he most controls, there's the least fighting. And we will obviously work with the opposition, whom we support, because they have an interest in making sure that you can get into those areas. So there ought to not be a problem if Assad is indeed going to comply. Thirdly, we're taking a weapon away from him that he has been using against his people. How can the opposition be worse off when we know they were preparing an offensive in Damascus and they were afraid of that offensive, which is why they used these weapons in the first place and indiscriminately killed people but stopped the offensive? This deprives Assad of a weapon. They were using the airplanes anyway. They were using the artillery anyway. And yes, that continues to be a problem. And that's exactly what the three of us and others are going to continue to focus on, pushing for Geneva, pushing for the political settlement, because the opposition and everyone else need to understand the best way to win the victory for the future of Syria is to have the Syrian people choose that future without Assad. And that will happen through a negotiated process, not through the destruction of the entire state and the creation of millions of more refugees and turmoil for the region. That's why this is such an important moment. If you can translate this into that kind of negotiated settlement, you can actually win a peace, not a protracted war. And that's why I agree with my colleagues. There is nothing incompatible or contradictory here.
Un dernier mot, si vous le voulez bien. Ce qui était sous-jacent dans beaucoup de vos questions et dans nos réponses,
what was understated in these questions or answers are the importance of reinforcing the moderance of the opposition in Syria. It's all taking place as if there were Assad on one side and terrorist extremists on the other, and as if they were fighting. But in fact, what helps Assad remain is that several communities are thinking that he may be a dictator, but what will happen if he leaves?
Ils ont
on the terrorist side,
entre Bachar el-Assad et eux-mêmes.
They have every interest in saying between Bashar and Assad there's nothing. So that all those who are against Assad will be obliged, forced in a way, to join them. But that, of course, is a completely wrong picture. If we want to both change Assad's regime and not fall under the violence of the terrorism, we need to support the moderate opposition, which recognizes the rights, of course, of the minorities and the principles according to which we want to work. It'll be up to the Syrians to decide in the future, but it's very important to understand it's not either Assad or terrorists, and that the political solution will go through an agreement between representatives of the regime and the moderate opposition. And I think this has not been clear enough in the public opinion's mind and needs to be reminded.